If there's one thing zombies do better than anything else, it's coming back from the dead. It's kind of their main party trick after all. The same goes for zombie-themed video games, once proudly crowding up our digital shopping malls, tropical islands, and front gardens, but beginning to rot away in obsolescence over the last few years. It didn't last for long though, as it turns out you just can't keep a good corpse down. So now we've got a whole new wave of shambling undead to fight off, with recent titles like Days Gone, World War Z, and of course, the excellent Resident Evil 2 Remake. And it's the Resident Evil series that stands up as the grand master of the genre, with over 20 years of survival horror pedigree to its name, being single-handedly responsible for our irrational fear of narrow mansion corridors. True to its subject matter, Resident Evil has seen a few revivals over the years, with the classic fixed perspective formula and enclosed environments giving way to open towns, faster action sequences, and coming full circle with Resident Evil 7's first-person, hyper-realistic horror show. So, to celebrate the resurgence of the reanimated, we thought we'd have a look at Resident Evil's long and illustrious history and pick out some of our favourite stories, if only to give Capcom a subtle hint to crack on with that next adventure. Seriously, remake or new title, we don't mind, we just need more of it! I'm Ben from TripleJump, and here are 10 things you didn't know about Resident Evil. Number 10. Changing perspectives. The fixed camera perspective of the early Resident Evil games is one of the most iconic staples of the series. Wandering through cramped locations with only a portion of an area visible at any one time lent itself perfectly to the nerve-wracking tone, never knowing what was lurking around the corner. Whether it's bumping into the hulking figure of Mr. X on one of his midnight snack runs, lickers bursting into an interrogation room, or every single bloody thing imaginable smashing through windows, that famous fixed perspective has created plenty of scares, and a crippling phobia of windows. With all this in mind, it's crazy to think the game's creator, Shinji Mikami, initially wanted to make it a first-person shooter, but due to technical limitations at the time, along with doubts about how effective an FPS-style horror game would be, led to a switch in perspective, a switch that was heavily inspired by Alone in the Dark and its fixed camera angles. Apparently, Mikami was unsure about the potential lack of immersion that a third-person viewpoint could bring, but tell that to a young Ben who refused to go near windows for weeks afterwards. Number 9. Terrible dialogue. The first Resident Evil did a lot of good things for survival horror, but clever dialogue wasn't one of them. The game is infamous for stilted delivery and absurd lines like,
"Terrible demons. Ouch!"
and
"Everything was plotted from the start by Umbrella. Ha!"
The ham-fisted writing was so bad, it kind of added to the charm, to be honest. That classic Jill Sandwich quote, for example, has been poked fun at by the likes of Dead Rising, and even in Capcom's own series, with a Jill Sandwich recipe found in mobile game Resident Evil Uprising. While some of the blame goes to your old video game friend translation issues, there's more to the story. Shinji Mikami had decided that the Japanese voiceovers sounded a bit lame, so English dubs were rushed out at the 11th hour, with an unproven crop of voice talent given no time, no context, and only 2 takes to get the lines recorded. Amateurs. Not like one take wonder over here, who can read out the lines, really doing the line, just saying the lines and having that line. Number 8. George Romero's rejected film script. If you were planning a movie version of the most successful zombie-killing game franchise of all time, there's only one person for the job, right? And we're not talking about Critical Nightmare director Uwe Boll. Sorry, Uwe. George A. Romero, the godfather of the zombie genre, was understandably top of the list for Capcom's big screen debut, with a back catalogue of classics like Night of the Living Dead, Day of the Dead, and Mr. Rogers Gets a Tonsillectomy. Haha. Scary stuff. George was actually already familiar with Resident Evil, having directed a live-action advert for the sequel, Biohazard 2, which, incidentally, leads us to our bonus fact of the day. You see, Biohazard was the Japanese title, but had to be changed for legal reasons, so they decided to base the name on the first game's location, a house full of nasty things, Resident Evil. Get it? Your bonus fact of the day is brought to you by Jill Sandwiches. Anyway, the Biohazard 2 trailer. Well, it was certainly impressive back in 1998 at least. But when George wrote a script for the movie adaptation, however, he stuck close to the source material, which is rather surprising as George hadn't actually played the game, but instead had watched a tape of his assistant playing it in a sort of retro let's play kind of way. Sadly, Capcom felt it simply wasn't very good, which is absurd considering the bonkers action sci-fi direction that Paul W.S. Anderson ended up taking it in. Number 7. Resi 7's method acting developers. Resident Evil 7's sinister first-person spook fest was a return to form for the franchise after the lukewarm reception of Action Heavy 6. It was yet another change of formula in an ever-evolving series, both reinvigorating the horror heavyweight and going back to its roots. Producer Masachika Kawata even said that it felt like they achieved an ideal image of what Resident Evil 1 could have been. The game was filled with terrifying scenes that did no favors for our sleep patterns, with one of the most iconic being the disturbing dinner table section. The developers were so keen to get this right, in fact, they acted it out and filmed with GoPros, which saw the scene play out remarkably similarly to the final version, albeit without the crunchy cockroach treat. A great deal of effort was made to get the setting right too, as members of the team went on a haunted locations tour of Osaka to find inspiration for their VHS sections, though, being totally honest, we can't see this being included in Osaka's tourist board promotions anytime soon. Number 6. Resi 1's 2-player plans. Considering the starting choice between either Jill Valentine or Chris Redfield and the fact that most of the game has another accomplice trailing you like a lost puppy, we're not really surprised that Resident Evil was intended to be a co-op adventure. Plus, everyone knows there's no place more romantic for a couple's first date than a grand mansion overrun with flesh-eating zombies, but unfortunately, rendering 2 separate copies of the mansion at the same time was a bit beyond the humble PS1's hardware capabilities, so they had to scrap their plans for tag-team zombie decapitation. Sorry, couples, but hey, you could always try a trip to Madame Tussauds to get your fill of hauntingly lifeless humanoids. This one's supposed to be Hannah Montana. Imagine. Oh god, no, that's the real one. The scrapped co-op proved once again that many of the ideas from Shinji Mikami and his team were years ahead of their time, with cooperative squad-based games very much still in vogue today. Their ambitions to create a Residence 4-2 was eventually realized with Resident Evil 5, which became a major departure for the series, so perhaps a solo Resi 1 was for the best. Ammo was scarce enough without having to share. Number 5. Weskers Butcher Shop. To drive up hype for the upcoming Resident Evil 6 release in 2012, Capcom sponsored a new shop opening in London's famous Smithfield Meat Market. The catch? The meat looked suspiciously like people. With hands, feet, arms, legs, ears, and numerous other appendages on offer, it was enough to make even the most meat-obsessed barbecue hipster turn away in disgust. Wesker & Sons offered such delicacies as a lovely human thigh steak or finger sausage, choosing to ditch subtlety for showmanship. I mean, they could have gone with long pig or even mystery meat, but I suppose Wesker's got nothing to hide, eh? Naturally, the shop didn't sell actual human meat, at least that's what I've been told to say until I get my family back. Rather, it was some creatively shaped normal meat, but this art installation still got plenty of column inches, even from the Daily Mail, an entity more dangerous and worthy of culling than the undead. Sadly, though, this may have been the best thing to come out of Resident Evil 6. Number 4. The Great Resident Evil 3 Dupe. There's a dark secret behind Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. It's got nothing to do with the titular Nemesis T-type itself, although we're 90% sure he's had plastic surgery to remove his lips. No, it turns out Resident Evil 3 has been living a lie this whole time. The truth is, it was never meant to be the third entry in the main series. Yeah, Resident Evil Not 3 was under development at the same time as Code Veronica, which was planned as the true sequel to Resi 2. The story featured Chris and Claire Redfield, now certified zombie-slaying veterans, with a more substantial narrative that just made sense as a proper sequel. Whereas Nemesis was planned as a spin-off, starring side character Hunk attempting to bring back a sample of the G-Virus from a luxury cruise liner. Stories differ regarding the reason for the switcheroo, but the popular tale is that Sony had locked Capcom into an exclusivity deal for main numbered titles. However, some sources say that it was done merely because Biohazard 3 would sell more than if it were titled Biohazard 1.9, which is what Mikami wanted at first. Either way, we've all been duped. Number 3. Resident Evil May Cry? Fans of the series had quite a shock when first scenes of Resident Evil 4 went public. Things had changed, man. No fixed camera angles, more action, and they weren't even technically zombies. Thankfully though, it all turned out pretty well. But for anyone scared of change, it could have been a whole lot worse. With Capcom starting work as early as 1999, the game was firmly aboard a development merry-go-round. 4 proposed versions were turned down during this time, one of which featured some seriously snazzy stylistic action sequences and a wisecracking silver-haired hero to boot. This faster-paced gameplay didn't exactly gel well with the established survival horror tone, but rather than throw away all that work, they decided, in true Resident Evil style, to raise this body from the dead and turn it into a whole new franchise. You and I know it today as Devil May Cry. A wildly successful series in its own right, though not known for its subtle psychological spooks. And another series that rose from the pile of discarded game corpses was Onimusha, intended as a Ninja House version of Resident Evil, but rightfully gaining its own independence. Number 2. Resident Evil 2 Fan Remake. The Resident Evil 2 remake that graced our consoles earlier this year was a love letter to fans everywhere, bringing back one of the series' best entries in glorious high definition and shaking things up enough to provide even veteran fans with new secrets and discoveries in some of our favourite games. But before Capcom started working on the official Resi Redux, a collection of die-hard fans were already working on an official update to the 1998 classic. Resident Evil 2 Reborn was a project by Italian indie studio Invader Games, now called Invader Studios, and saw the familiar police station setting revamped in Unreal Engine 4. So when Capcom started making the official remake, they approached Invader Games and asked them to stop production. And that's asked, not told, mind you. No legal demands, no cease and desist orders, and no animosity, just a good-natured agreement like sensible adults. Nintendo. Even better, Capcom invited the developers to a meeting to discuss their ideas for the official remake, which we can only guess helped inspire the final masterpiece. They even went so far as to thank the studio in the credits, which is high praise indeed. And don't worry, Invader Studios' hard work was not in vain, as they're currently creating a new game called Daymare 1998. Number 1. Inspired by Sweet Home. Before there was an evil residence, there was a very sweet home. Aw, that sounds lovely. Well, actually, Capcom's OG House of Horrors wasn't nearly as friendly and welcoming as the name would suggest. This 1989 RPG for the Famicom was only released in Japan due to its brutal and graphic content. And in fairness, considering the time of release, the pixel art still paints quite the gruesome picture. And when Resident Evil was still but a twinkle in Capcom's eye, their first plan was to create a sequel to Sweet Home. Seems mad comparing the two now. Sweet Home is basically Final Fantasy with blood and gore and a turn-based combat system that you'd think would hinder any feeling of tension and suspense, but look closely. The large manor house setting, a favourite haunting ground for the supernatural, letters and notes left dotted about, slowly unravelling pieces of the story, intricate puzzles that require item collection and backtracking through previous areas. Oh, yep, look at that door animation. That settles it. Resident Evil prequel confirmed. Despite the difference in genre, so many key elements that make Resident Evil so iconic today were inspired by this relatively niche horror RPG. And this was an intentional move too. Shinji Mikami himself was a big fan of Sweet Home and said that his boss at the time, Takuro Fujiwara, wanted a horror game using systems from that game. And the rest, as they say, is history. And there we are, 10 delicious nuggets of Resident Evil knowledge to snack on in between courses of peppered human steak. Yum! Let us know which delightful undead factoids we missed in the comments below. You can follow myself and TripleJump on Twitter here, and while you're at it, why not support the things you enjoy by having a look at our Patreon? Finally, don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. I'm Ben from TripleJump, and thanks for watching.